Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting. And today I am revisiting a whiskey that I had in the past that I rated very highly, and I've sort of been inspired to do this because after doing a tasting of Rittenhouse, I was surprised at how my palate has evolved with that whiskey. And so this is a whiskey, Kilchoman Sanaig, that I have forever rated since I first had it as one of my favorite whiskeys because it has a lot of sherry and smoke influence, that peat smoke influence on it. And I've been looking for that perfect combination of those two flavors. And I've tasted quite a few sherry and smoke whiskeys here over the last year and a half or so. Ever since I bought this bottle, I continue the search. And I haven't tasted this for a while, so I thought well, maybe I'll come back and I'll do a tasting on it, see how my palate has improved over time or evolved. And this is part of the reason why I tell you it's good to hang on to your old tasting notes, because these tasting notes are from the first time that I ever tasted it, which was out of a Flaviar tasting pack. And then this is when I first bought that bottle. So maybe we're talking neck pour, early experiences with this bottle. And now this bottle has been around for at least a year, and now it's down to about that much. So some oxidization may have happened over time. So it may not only be an evolving palate, but it may also be change in the liquid because air has had an opportunity to group up next to this whiskey over a period of time. So I'm going to do a tasting, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to look and see if my old notes agree with where I am on the tasting today. So on the nose, immediately you get, that's interesting. That's a note I've never picked up before. It actually comes with the smoke I would describe as somewhere between a matchstick and a tarry smoke. And then there's an underlying fruit. It's kind of hard to pick out. And then there is a chlorine kind of a smell coming through. Reminds me of a pool. Really interesting. Maybe it's summertime. And I'm thinking, let me go for a dip in the pool. Interesting. I have never smelled that before. And the thing that impressed me about something like Octomore is that you could still define the fruit that was underneath. This, I can't necessarily get to it. It's a bright fruit. It's not a plum or a raisin, unless it's like a sweet raisin. I don't know. Yeah, it's the smoke is almost slightly heavy-handed in that respect. So let's jump in and do a taste. Cheers. So the first thing that hits you is you get that you get the fruit right off the bat. The sherry influence comes in right off, and then the smoke kind of comes in, and then it turns into almost like a burnt smoke at the end. A little toasted, but then it gets this little burnt note. There is, and I don't know, I think this spends some time in bourbon cask because there's a little bit of a caramel note that comes out there as well. This is one thing I didn't like about this bottle. It doesn't give you a whole lot of information. It tells you non-chill filtered, natural color, but it doesn't really tell you what this has been aged in. And so I'm just going to assume that it spent some time in a bourbon barrel because I get a little bit of that caramel. I have to define what that flavor is because it is something that is very distinct to me, and it relates to something almost like maybe it's a grain note that comes in with that reminds me of Belgian waffles for some reason. So that kind of comes in there as well. But the smoke really stays throughout. It's pleasant. on the palate, but it is truly a smoky whiskey with a little sherry influence. It's not a 50-50 blend to me. It's not like a perfect marriage. The smoke is still a little more aggressive, and maybe that's why in the past I really rated this as like a top-notch whiskey for me, because I wanted to have that smoke out front and I didn't mind the sherry kind of taking a back seat. But I'm actually kind of craving a little bit more of what the heck is going on behind that smoke. So let's look at the old notes and see during my very first tasting of it what I picked up. So on this I said weak on the nose, which it's not. This is definitely not. And yet it says here that it's actually bourbon and sherry. So I was picking up bourbon out of that. Light pepper on the palate. It's kind of on the finish for me. Finish, ethanol, minimum pepper, long but light, fresh, minty. Maybe a little bit. Interesting. I don't know why I rated it so highly, because those don't really sound, if I'm tasting ethanol in it, which I'm not tasting that here, kind of surprises me that I rated it so highly. So this is actually my newer review on it, probably when I first bought this bottle. On the nose, sweet smoke. Yes, I totally agree with that. Dark chocolate. Interesting. Maybe. Wasn't really looking for that. And here I say I'm getting a sea character, and I maybe a hint, but it's not, to me, it's not overly briny. It's got a little bit of a briny character to it. And then ash, but not intense. And it's not intense. It's pleasant. It just doesn't, it's just like smoke is the main thing at the party here. On the palate, delicious dark fruit. Okay, I definitely get the fruit. I don't know if it's as dark as I think I was saying here. It actually tastes like there may be some like apple kind of orchard fruit notes coming through on it as well that are blending. That's making it a little bit harder to distinguish. And again, the smoke is just covering the experience. The finish, more tannin. Not really getting tannin here. Saccharin. Less polished, clean, Kool-Aid berry. That's interesting. I have to think about that. And then caramel lingers. So, yeah, it does linger, and it's actually on the front of the palate experience as well. So, in rating this, to say that I once rated this as high as Laphroaig, or in the neighborhood of Laphroaig 10, which has long been my favorite whiskey, I don't know. I don't know that I put it up that high at this point, because it's not necessarily what I'm looking for. I want the smoke, but I'm almost begging for a little bit more of the sherry influence. And the sherry influence does come through more on the palate and towards the finish. And I get that Kool-Aid thing. I understand what I'm saying at that juncture in this tasting, but it's funny that I wasn't really looking for that before. And that's the thing that you got to remember when you're doing these tastings too, is that just like when you're doing a tasting at a distillery, and if the guide is giving you tasting notes, you're gonna find what the guide is telling you, and so it throws you off. It doesn't help you actually learn anything, because you're just being pointed to particular flavors when you may have found a flavor that was on your mind at the time, or that you enjoy, that the guide would never have picked out in a million years. And so that's why it's kind of good when you're hearing tasting notes to take them with a grain of salt. If you're watching these, if you're watching Ralphie, if you're watching Whiskey Nerd, if you're watching me, if you're watching Dusty Dan, My Bourbon Journey, any of those, and you're getting tasting notes, forget them when you jump in and you start doing a tasting yourself, and just learn for yourself and see what you find. Because if you like licorice, you're going to find licorice a lot faster than any of us are going to find it. If you like Kool-Aid, or if your mind's on Kool-Aid at that moment, you may come up with that tasting note I never would have come up with, or, you know, vice versa, that sort of thing. So just some friendly advice. And again, the reason to keep notes, because when you're keeping notes like this, you get a chance to be in a different frame of mind, an expanded palate potentially, and you'd be surprised at how much your tasting notes are going to change over time. So look, I enjoyed this. I'm not going to put it in my excellent category now, because I'm looking for maybe a little bit more diversity, and maybe the nose matching the palate a little bit more on this. So I'm going to put this in the very good category, because I think that that's where it deserves to go for my palate. But you may be in a different mood, you may feel different, and like I say, take my ratings with a grain of salt, because we're all different, and this is the fun of tasting and learning and growing our palates. So my tasting notes are training wheels in a way, as are Ralphie's, are as anybody else's. So again, take them with a grain of salt. But yeah, I'm gonna enjoy the second sip of this. If you enjoy the video, if you learned stuff from these videos, if there's something you want to learn about, and you think I know the answers or can find the answers for you, you know, post down in the comments. I love getting comments from you guys. And if you like the video, then go ahead and click the like to let me know. And if you want to subscribe to get more episodes, because you haven't subscribed yet, I would love to have you on board. Until next time, cheers and slanjava. It's very enjoyable. Belgian waffles. Ooh, I am craving Belgian waffles now.